Hi, my name is Constantine, and I've been using Nim as my primary language for hobby development for over a decade. Today, I'd like to talk about applying Nim in front-end development. My goal is to show that Nim isn't just a viable option for front-end, which is not news, but an option you can actually compare to the mainstream frameworks like React or Vue in terms of usability, reusability, app size, and programmer's experience. First off, Nim has had a React-like framework for ages, a framework called Karax. It's a lean, robust, and mature framework. It produces tiny bundles and is production ready as it is. However, to compete against React, it takes some sugar to make a developer's life easier. To me, the most critical ones were routing and components. And this is why I wrote Kraut, along with its companion app Zour and Carcass, respectively the missing routing and component layers for Karax. Let's first talk a bit about Karax and what foundation it offers us. First, it implements a virtual DOM, which is the base mechanic behind React and similar frameworks. The Karax implementation is really straightforward. It just defines procs that are evaluated in a tight loop to redraw the UI. Karax cares about doing this optimally. Second, Karax gives us a great DSL to actually write the pages. It's like React's JSX, but instead of being a separate HTML-like language, it's just proper Nim. Finally, Karax offers vNode type that represents a renderable chunk. It's almost a component, and we are going to turn it into a component a bit later in Carcass. This is already enough to build basic apps. Here's a quick example of a Karax app. And here is how this app looks rendered. The code is pretty self-explanatory, but there is one line I want to draw your attention to. See how we access the hash part. It's just a string. You can imagine how painful it can be to manage multiple routes. We have to parse the string into meaningful chunks all the time. We must handle heading, trailing, and repeating slashes and verbal parts manually. Most apps will have more than one location to render. Also, you will often need the same location to show different data, depending on the URL param. Vanilla Karax doesn't offer route management, so this is why Kraut was created. Kraut implements URL parsing and matching. You can define routes as strings to be matched against the current URL. For every route, you define a proc to be executed when this route matches, which is very simple logic. Kraut builds upon Karax's built-in vNode type, meaning that your procedures that render routes should just return a vNode. You can use variable parts in your routes and pass get params. Kraut will capture the values and pass them to the renderer. Here's our previous app, but with routes added. It renders essentially the same as the previous version, but our code has been improved in multiple places. First, our routes are now defined as a simple sequence of pairs and can be stored separately from other logic. You can even split your route definition across multiple modules and then build a single sequence out of multiple chunks. Second, render procedure can now live in a separate module, as it receives all its context from Kraut. And third, we no longer work with raw strings. Instead, we have a nice table-based interface to access query params and URL params. By allowing us to separate route definition and route processing, Kraut actually paves the way for having a standardized routing convention. This convention is implemented by Kraut's companion app, Zour. Zour is a command line app for Karax project setup with a certain code structure. It also allows us to add new routes quickly. Zour introduces a new abstraction called page. Page represents a location that has a route. This logic maps very naturally to your app's business logic. For example, you can have a page for your user profile, a page for the shopping cart, or a search page. Another addition that Zour makes is that it creates a state module in your app. It's a standard module that holds the global state of your app, allowing you to pass the data uh, across various modules. It's a very simple idea, but it works really well in practice. So here are some quick examples of Zour commands and the code they produce. The commands are just the project initialization and creation of a new page with a new route. This new route has a variable part, as you can see, and the value of this variable part will be stored in a variable called user ID. The page code produced by Zour is basically just a render proc which accepts the context variable, which holds the values of all the captured URL and query params, and basically renders the page. Notice that we use the global state to store and get the actual the current page. This is just one example of how this state module can be used. Thanks to Zour and Kraut's higher level of abstractions and enforced code structure, we can actually start building a component system. And this is where Carcass enters the stage. It's a package that helps create components. First, Karkas gives you a syntax sugar to apply styles to vnodes. While Karax offers vnode styling by default, its usage requires a lot of redundant typing and type conversion, basically to please the compiler. Since I don't want to focus on pleasing the compiler and instead focus on my business logic, I've added this sugar that takes the heavy lifting out of my shoulders. With this sugar, you can create self-contained Svelte-like components, where all the information necessary to render a particular component is stored within a single module. Finally, Karkas adds sugar for layouting based on Flexbox. It introduces several easy-to-use primitives that allow you to quickly lay out your page. We will see an example of these primitives in use on the next slide. So here's a sample app generated with Zour and layouted with Karkas. First, here's the code for the navigation entry component. Notice that this component is basically reusable not only in this particular app, but across multiple apps, because there is no logic that is specific to the app we're developing right now. It's just a navigation entry, which can be shown in our top navigation panel. Notice that this component has access to the state module and therefore can understand whether it's being rendered on the current page or not, which allows it to react accordingly. If it's being rendered on the current page, then it should not be a link, it shouldn't be clickable. Otherwise, it should be a link to another page. Also, you can spot Karkas's arrow proc that converts sequences to v-styles and merges multiple styles together. In this particular example, our navigation entry is a box primitive with some additional styling applied to it. Another interesting proc is K, just the letter K. It simply converts a string into a K-string, which is Karax's special string format. Now, let's look at the layout. In Carcass, layouts are just components that can render other components inside of them. This one has its styles stored in a separate value and then applied after Carcass's built-in layout presets for top panel and horizontal stack. Notice how we make a component render other components. We simply pass a vnode and iterate over its children. You can see that on the last 3 lines. And finally, here is the actual page code. We now render its content inside a layout component, which ensures every page gets a nice navigation bar. And this is done with a simple do notation trick. By using the syntax to actually render all the children starting with H1 line inside of the layout component. Here is the end result. You can see our app using standard layout across pages and correctly reacting to navigation. And this is the end of my talk. Here are some links to help you explore the topic further. First, here's the Canon Chat app, which I created recently, and whose web app UI is created entirely with Nim, using the tools that I've just described. You'll find the complete demo app code in the presentation repo on GitHub. And finally, here are the links to Kraut, Zour, and Carcass. Please feel free to use them, send PRs, and report issues. Thanks.